The agent inspection process. In the previous section, we discussed how agents can protect their interests by observing and documenting visible property conditions and recommending professional inspections when concerns arise. That discussion leads directly into the next step of professional risk management, the agent inspection process. The agent inspection process is not a technical inspection like the one performed by a licensed home inspector. Instead, it is a structured walkthrough and documentation process designed to help the agent identify visible concerns, ask appropriate questions, and communicate observations that may require further investigation. A practical approach to this process begins by walking the property both inside and outside, carefully observing visible conditions, and documenting those observations in writing. Notes should include descriptions of the issue observed, questions asked of the seller, and any recommendations made to protect the buyer's interests. Detailed documentation is important because vague descriptions rarely provide meaningful protection if a dispute arises later. For example, if an agent observes a crack in the foundation and simply writes, "The foundation of the house is cracked," and the seller acknowledges this fact, that description may be considered incomplete. A vague description may not explain the extent of the observation, the questions asked, or the agent's recommendation for further evaluation. If the crack later turns out to indicate a major structural issue, the agent's minimal documentation may not demonstrate that the agent acted responsibly. A stronger description would include more detail and context, such as explaining the observation, the seller's response, and the recommendation made to the buyer. For example, a more protective statement might read, "I observed a crack in the foundation measuring approximately 1 to 2 inches. I asked the seller if they were aware of the crack, and the seller indicated that they were aware of it. I asked whether the crack extended further into the foundation or had been professionally evaluated. The seller stated that they did not know. Based on this observation, I recommended that the buyer obtain an inspection from a licensed foundation specialist during the inspection period." This type of documentation demonstrates several important steps taken by the agent. It shows that the agent observed a condition, asked questions, communicated the issue, and recommended professional evaluation. Courts often evaluate whether the agent acted reasonably under the circumstances. Detailed documentation helps demonstrate that the agent recognized the potential issue and encouraged the buyer to investigate further. Following up with the seller. After completing the property walkthrough and documenting observations, the next step in the agent inspection process is to follow up with the seller regarding any concerns identified during the walkthrough. The purpose of these conversations is to determine whether the seller is aware of the issue and whether the issue has been previously evaluated or repaired. Comparing the agent's observations with the seller's knowledge may also help ensure that the seller's disclosure form accurately reflects known conditions affecting the property. For example, if an agent observes staining on a ceiling that may indicate a past leak, the agent should ask the seller whether they are aware of any previous water intrusion, whether repairs were performed, and whether the problem has been resolved. This conversation allows the seller to update or clarify the disclosure statement, ensuring that buyers receive accurate information about the property's condition. Documenting the agent's disclosure. Whether the agent's documentation is recorded on a formal disclosure form or simply written notes, the record should be signed and dated by the agent and the buyer whenever possible. Written documentation helps establish that the agent communicated the observations and recommendations to the buyer during the transaction process. A helpful practice is to include a statement above the signature lines confirming that the document has been reviewed and acknowledged by the parties. For example, a statement may read, "My signature below indicates that I have read, understand, and acknowledge receiving a copy of this document." Once signed, the document becomes a written record demonstrating the agent's effort to protect the buyer's interests and encourage further investigation where appropriate. This written documentation can be especially valuable if questions arise after closing regarding what the agent observed or communicated during the transaction. Why detailed documentation matters. The more detailed description provided earlier is better than the vague description because it demonstrates several important elements of professional conduct. First, it clearly identifies the agent's observation of a potential flaw. Second, it shows that the agent attempted to determine the extent of the problem by asking the seller additional questions. Third, it confirms that the agent communicated the issue to the buyer. Finally, it demonstrates that the agent recommended further investigation by a qualified professional. These steps show that the agent acted responsibly and took reasonable steps to protect the client's interests. Courts evaluating disclosure disputes often look for evidence that the agent recognized potential concerns and advised the buyer appropriately. Inspection process. During a listing appointment. The agent inspection process is equally important when taking a new listing. During the listing appointment, the agent should walk the property with the seller and carefully observe visible conditions throughout the property. While walking the property, the agent should record observations about potential concerns and discuss them with the seller. This process helps ensure that the seller's disclosure form reflects known issues affecting the property. By identifying concerns early, the agent can also encourage the seller to obtain repairs, gather documentation, or prepare accurate disclosures before the property is marketed to potential buyers. Summary of the agent inspection process. The agent inspection process is designed to help real estate professionals recognize visible concerns, communicate those concerns effectively, and recommend appropriate professional inspections. Agents should question the seller regarding any flaws observed during the walkthrough. These conversations should determine whether the seller was previously aware of the issue and whether repairs or evaluations have already been performed. Agents should also ask whether the seller knows whether the issue has been fully resolved. For example, if the seller previously experienced water intrusion, the agent should determine whether the issue was repaired and whether it continues to occur during heavy rain. If there is any uncertainty regarding the condition of the property, the agent should inform the buyer and recommend that the buyer obtain a professional inspection or evaluation from a qualified specialist. Although some jurisdictions may not specifically require written agent disclosures, providing written documentation is a strong risk management practice. Written documentation demonstrates that the agent took steps to identify potential issues and encouraged appropriate investigation. Any written comments included in the agent's documentation should be detailed enough to show that the agent observed the condition, attempted to understand the extent of the issue, and recommended further investigation when necessary. The document should be signed and dated by the agent and the buyer whenever possible. Copies should be provided to the buyer's agent if applicable, the seller, and the seller's agent so that all parties involved in the transaction understand the observations and recommendations made during the process. Online discussion. Why is detailed documentation important during the agent inspection process? Answer. Detailed documentation demonstrates that the agent observed potential issues, communicated them to the buyer, and recommended further investigation. This record helps protect the agent if questions arise after closing. Why should agents follow up with the seller regarding observations made during the walkthrough? Answer. Following up with the seller helps determine whether the seller was already aware of the issue and whether it has been repaired or evaluated. This information helps ensure the seller's disclosure is accurate. Why should agents recommend professional inspections when observing potential property concerns? Answer. Professional inspectors have the training and expertise to evaluate structural, mechanical, and environmental issues that fall outside the scope of the real estate agent's expertise.